13. New most disturbing. True Appalachian. Wilderness horror stories I hadn't planned to return. The old fire tower had been nothing more than a fading memory etched into my mind alongside rusted beams and summers that felt hotter every year. The forest had grown around it in quiet, patient waves, as if the ridge itself had swallowed decades while I wandered elsewhere. I expected the tower to stand empty, a skeletal monument to time and neglect. The metal, warm and dull under the morning sun, the steps slick with moss and rain. The air was different this time. Not sharp, not cold, just muted, like someone had pressed their hand over the mountain's voice. Birds made half-hearted attempts at song, and the wind moved reluctantly, skimming the trees without rustling them. Even the creek below sounded smaller, more distant, like it had been muffled with cloth. I shook my head, telling myself I was reading too much into it. Mountains always had moods. But then I saw the footprints, fresh, deliberate, pressed into the dirt and pine needles at the base of the lower steps. They weren't mine. I'd arrived alone, and no one had been on this ridge for miles. The prints led upward, curling around the first metal step, vanishing into the shadows cast by the tower's frame. I crouched, studying them. Boots with soles I didn't recognize. Size, large, heavy. Someone had been here recently. The logical part of me screamed to leave, to turn back and never touch that rusted ladder again. But a different part, older, stubborn, the part that had climbed the tower every season, every fire, every false alarm, pulled me forward. I ascended. The first step groaned beneath my weight, the metal vibrating through my boots in a tone I had memorized long ago. The scent of rust and pine filled my nose, and for a moment, the forest breathed with me, the hush of the morning wrapping around the tower like a shroud. Each step higher felt less solid. Not because the metal had weakened, but because the air itself seemed to thicken, cling to my clothes, to my skin. I glanced over the railing. The valley stretched below, mist curling around the trees, the creek a silver thread. Ordinarily, that view calmed me, grounded me. Today it looked wrong. The colors were muted, the shadows longer than they should have been. Shapes in the mist seemed almost deliberate, lingering where they had no reason to exist. I reached the first landing and froze. The prints hadn't ended at the base, they continued upward. I hadn't imagined them. Each step bore evidence of someone else, someone unseen, climbing beside me or perhaps above. No sound, no voices, just impressions pressed into the steel. My heart kicked, but I ignored it, gripping the railing tighter, ascending toward the higher platforms. The metal ladder rattled softly as I climbed, the old bolts quivering under my weight. Every nerve in my body told me to stop, to jump down and leave this mountain behind. And yet, I kept going, drawn by a memory I couldn't name, a pull that felt almost like responsibility. Years of fire seasons had taught me to respect the ridge, its moods, its dangers, but nothing had prepared me for this quiet. The sense that the mountain was waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know. At the upper landing, the air thickened, damp and metallic. The scent of pine and earth faded, replaced by something sharper, a tang I couldn't place. I scanned the platform. Rusted beams stretched in every direction, the floorboards warped from years of sun and ice. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet the hairs along my neck pricked. There was someone here. Someone or something had climbed these steps, had pressed its weight alongside mine, and I could feel it in the vibration through the metal. subtle, almost imperceptible. I told myself it was the wind, the forest settling, an echo of my own footsteps. But instinct is rarely wrong. I rested my hand on the railing, letting the cool metal steady me. The prints ended somewhere above, higher than I had thought possible. Whoever or whatever had left them was waiting too. I could feel it in the silence, in the way the mountain had stopped breathing just long enough to let me know I was no longer alone. I didn't hear anything at first. No voices, no rustle, no hint of life. But the ridge seemed different, sharper somehow, the silence pressing at my ears. A shiver ran up my spine as I realized the mountain had exhaled behind me. It wasn't the wind that moved, it was something else. Patient, deliberate, following. My hand tightened around the railing. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in the hush, and I knew, without looking, that the footprints weren't alone anymore. I took the final step onto the platform, and the forest opened beneath me. Mist swirled around the legs of the tower like water around a stone. The sky had grown pale, washed in early morning light. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. That's when night settled over the ridge faster than I expected, folding the forest into a blanket of shadow. The valley below vanished into black, and the tower became a lone silhouette against the stars, metal beams dark and unyielding. I had planned to stay only until the sun dipped, to survey the tower, check the ladders, reminisce. Now every creak of steel felt deliberate, every whisper of wind suspicious. The first sound came softly, metallic and faint, a footstep, echoing across the hollow girders of the lower deck. I froze mid-step, listening. The echo lingered, then faded, but my gut told me it hadn't been wind. I shifted, testing the movement of the tower, and the sound responded. Another step, perfectly timed, as if someone had matched mine, pacing just beneath the boards. I climbed, cautiously, each rung rattling under my weight, metal shivering like brittle bones. I told myself it was nothing. Wildlife, branches brushing, the tower settling, but the air felt wrong. There was a rhythm to it now, a deliberate cadence. Tap, tap, pause, tap. Not random. Someone or something was moving beneath me, tracing me. I stopped halfway up and pressed an ear against the cold steel. The steps continued, circling, matching my heartbeat. Tap, tap. Closer. I realized then that the sound wasn't coming from the floorboards themselves. It was inside them, inside the hollow steel, vibrating through the beams. I could feel it in my bones. Something was walking below me, invisible, deliberately echoing the motions of the man it knew. I took another step, the metal groaning beneath me. Tap, tap. A deliberate pause, and then a single sharp strike directly beneath my feet. The sound was crisp, unnatural. I jumped back, hand gripping the railing. My boots scraped the floorboards, and the echo responded immediately. A metallic mimicry, deliberate, knowing. My pulse accelerated. Whoever or whatever was down there knew me. It had learned the rhythm of my steps. The air grew colder. Not the cold of night, but the cold of something pressing against your chest. Unrelenting, almost sentient. I could see my breath fogging in slow clouds, curling upward and lingering like it didn't want to leave. The mist of my exhalations seemed to move against the flow of air, stretching toward the base of the tower. I wanted to call out, to demand it reveal itself, but no sound escaped. My throat tightened, voice trapped somewhere between fear and disbelief. I tested a step, just a small one, tapping the metal lightly with my toe. Tap, tap, then a pause. A slow, deliberate metallic creak followed, a drag of weight across the steel below me. Not footsteps. Something heavier, moving closer, aligning with my position. I took another step. The echo followed instantly, a mirror of my motion, yet wrong, slightly off in tone, as though it were learning the shape of me. The tower trembled subtly, not from the wind, there was none, but from the steps beneath, synchronized with mine, climbing, pacing, waiting. I backed toward the railing, chest tight. My fingers touched the metal beams, and the vibration ran upward, through my arms, through my spine. Each tremor was precise, deliberate, a warning, a presence. I wasn't just being followed, I was being studied. Then it happened. A tap, sharp and deliberate, directly beneath my left foot. I froze. The sound lingered, resonating through the hollow frame, and I felt it in the soles of my boots. The air shifted, another tap came, this time from the right side. Something was moving beneath the floorboards, circling me, aware of every motion. It was waiting for me to descend, waiting to see how I would react. I leaned over the railing, straining to see anything in the darkness below. Nothing. No shadow, no figure, no branch or animal. Just the cold steel and the echoing taps, each one deliberate, precise, terrifyingly familiar. My breath came in short bursts, fog curling upward and lingering, filling the hollow like smoke. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm matched my heartbeat now. I realized I had been climbing in time with it all along. A sudden creak beneath my right heel made me jump. My foot lifted, and the sound followed immediately. Tap, tap, like it was learning, adjusting, waiting for me to misstep. I took a step backward, slower this time, and the pattern changed. A deliberate pause, a breath held in the silence. Then a final tap, sharper than any before, right beneath my footboard. It wasn't an echo, it wasn't wind. It was deliberate, it was waiting. I wanted to descend, to abandon the tower entirely, but the fear rooted me to the spot. The rhythm had claimed me. Tap, pause, tap, each strike like a pulse, like something breathing through the steel. I realized as the mountain exhaled around me that I was no longer moving alone. Something was beneath me, pacing, learning, adapting. And then the sound shifted, a single, deliberate tap beneath the floorboards that didn't match my motion at all. It was not imitation, it was intent. I didn't wait to see what would come next. My hands gripped the ladder, my boots pounding against metal, and I descended faster than I had in decades. The echo followed, now chaotic, imperfect, learning too quickly, closing in, never leaving me. By the time I reached the base, the night had grown colder still, the air heavy and metallic. I stopped, panting, staring at the tower. The wind died entirely that night. The ridge held its breath, and the tower no longer creaked like a lifeless structure. It seemed to inhale, exhale, waiting. I perched on the middle platform, knees pressed to my chest, staring into the black that pooled beneath the tower's frame. Every shadow felt deliberate, every twitch of metal like a heartbeat. And then it began. A voice. Faint at first, a murmuring ripple through the steel beams, almost too soft to register. I froze, every nerve flaring. The words weren't new. They were fragments of memory, phrases I'd heard 100 times in my life on the ridge, calls from seasons long past, shouts from fellow rangers, names of towers and trails I had memorized decades ago. How could any living person know these things? I hadn't spoken them aloud in years. The voice shifted, not just echoing the past, but shaping it. I heard the laugh of Pete Harrow, my old partner from summer patrol, the crackle of his firelighter, the shuffle of boots across snow, every detail I thought I had buried in memory. It was perfect. It was impossible. Then it changed again. Familiar tones bent into those of others long gone. Names I hadn't spoken since I was a boy, voices etched in memory, now alive, pressing through the metal around me. The sound didn't come from a single spot. It came from everywhere, filling the tower like fog. It circled me, rising and falling, whispering secrets I had never shared, speaking truths only I could know. I clutched the railing, trying to convince myself that it was a recording, a trick of the wind, something rational. But the voice, it was alive, shaping itself to me, learning me. I tried moving toward the ladder, but the words followed, bending to my motion, altering their pitch as if mimicking my steps, my rhythm. Every syllable struck a chord in my chest, and I realized then what it was doing. It wasn't just recalling the past, it was drawing me into it. And then it spoke my name. Not a whisper, not a crackle through the steel, but clear, full, exact. Every syllable perfect, as though it had waited decades to speak it aloud. I froze, every muscle tight. The hairs along my arms lifted. I knew, with an instinct deeper than fear, that nothing alive had learned my name like that. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone climbing the ladders, a face pressed to the beams. Nothing, only the hollow steel, dark and unyielding, yet somehow vibrating with intent. My breath fogged in the cold night air, curling toward the words that followed me as if they had weight. The voice grew bolder, shaping itself into the tones of the people I had once trusted. Pete, Jim, Rachel, the ones who had patrolled the ridge beside me, who had vanished long before my retirement. Their tones twisted, a soft, sick imitation, not quite perfect, but enough to convince the mind that what it heard was reality. Each memory voice repeated a fragment from my life, each sentence drawing me deeper into the tower's hollow core. I realized then that this was no echo, no recording. It was intelligence, patient and deliberate, learning me, knowing me in ways that should have been impossible. Every syllable whispered secrets of my past, mistakes I thought forgotten, corners of memory that I hadn't touched in years. It reminded me of paths I had walked, trails I had left, the exact moments I had taken each step up this mountain. And then, just when my stomach had turned cold and my chest felt hollow, the voice bent again. It wasn't any of them anymore. It had learned to shape itself into a single new presence, one that felt impossibly close, soft, almost intimate, breath-like in its cadence. I felt it behind me, pressing against the base of my skull, filling the space with its warmth and threat. It whispered my name again. Only this time, it wasn't asking. It was asserting. It was marking. It was announcing that it knew the shape of me, the pattern of my steps, the history that no living person could have memorized. I spun around. Nothing. Only the steel, cold and indifferent. The night pressed against me, thick as blood, carrying a faint, metallic tang that clung to my nostrils. Tap. A faint echo answered from the boards below, deliberate and patient. The whispering didn't stop. It rose, pressing into my ears, bending into a language I recognized, yet had never learned. For hours, or maybe minutes, time had lost its meaning. The voice continued, shifting between tones, memories, and names. It spoke with intent, learning, observing. It was not the past. It was me, mirrored, analyzed, reconstructed. Every word struck a chord in my chest, a memory I hadn't shared, a truth I hadn't admitted, and a fear I hadn't yet named. By the time the first light of dawn began to spill across the ridge, I had not slept. My knees were scraped from gripping the railing, my fingers raw from the cold steel. And still, the whispers continued, fading only gradually, as if granting me temporary reprieve. I descended from the tower that morning with a new understanding. Whatever it was, whatever haunted the hollow steel, it was no mere echo of the past. It had learned the shape of me. It knew my name. And when I returned, climbing the steps would not be the same. I thought the morning light would bring relief. The ridge glowed faintly gold as I stepped from the tower, boots crunching against frost-hardened dirt. The air seemed ordinary at first, cold, crisp, familiar. I expected to follow the trail down, retrace my steps, and leave this ridge behind. I expected nothing. But the mountain had other plans. The first fork in the trail seemed innocent, a simple split where moss and stone created twin paths. I chose the left path, the one I thought would take me down. Minutes passed. Hours. I couldn't tell. The sun lingered high and then dipped low, and each tree, each rock, each moss-covered root felt slightly off. Familiar, yet not. And then I saw it, the tower, far below, as though I had never left. I cursed under my breath, turned, and retraced my steps, or tried to, but the trail had changed. Branches had shifted, roots tangled differently, the path itself curling into a loop I had never walked before. I felt the weight of the ridge pressing in, the air heavier, the silence too complete, too deliberate. Every sound, the distant cry of a hawk, the snap of frost underfoot, was amplified, yet hollow, like the mountain was listening, rearranging itself around me. I tried another path. Right this time. Same result. I climbed a small rise, hoping to spot a landmark, a familiar contour, anything to guide me down. The tower appeared again, its metal frame glinting in the fading light, always at the base, always waiting. My pulse quickened. My breaths came ragged. The mountain was folding, bending reality around that structure, drawing me back. And then the forest shifted in a way I couldn't explain. Trails I had just walked disappeared under the underbrush. Trees stretched taller, angles changed. I turned in every direction, but the horizon never offered escape. The sun sank behind a ridge I didn't remember being there, and a cold fog crept upward, thick and dense, as if exhaling from the forest itself. The mountain wasn't just blocking me, it was corralling me, twisting space and time to make me climb the tower again. I stumbled, tripping over roots that hadn't been there moments ago, landing hard on the cold earth. My hands pressed into soil that seemed almost sticky, vibrating faintly under my palms. The silence was complete. Not a bird, not a wind, not a single creature stirred. Only the tower waited, and somewhere beneath the hum of cold air, I heard a whisper. Soft, distant, yet intimately close. My name, carried across the ridge by some force I could not see. I scrambled to my feet, trying one last route. Down, left, right, any direction away from the tower. And still, the paths twisted back. I began to understand what the rangers had once whispered about this ridge, the way the mountain swallowed travelers, the way trails looped and spiraled like a maze built by an unseen hand. Not all who came here left in the same reality they entered. Twilight bled across the trees, shadows lengthening unnaturally, wrapping around me like ropes. My pulse pounded in my ears. My mind raced, trying to rationalize. Perhaps I was tired, dehydrated. Perhaps the years of isolation in the woods had frayed my memory. But I knew better. Rationality didn't account for a ridge that folded itself, for paths that led nowhere but back to the same tower. Rationality didn't explain the whispers that followed me from the shadows, learning the shape of my steps. Hours or minutes later, I found myself at the base of the tower again. Every stone, every splintered beam looked the same, yet somehow sharper, more deliberate. The metal glinted as if freshly polished by unseen hands. I hadn't taken the path back. The path had taken me. And somewhere above, a faint creak, a sigh of metal suggested the tower had felt my presence, had been waiting for me. I tried to walk away again. The fog thickened, curling around my legs like grasping fingers. The trees leaned in, their branches intertwining overhead, forming tunnels that funneled me back to the same point. I turned in desperation, shouting into the cold air, but my voice returned to me muffled, echoing like it had been swallowed and spit out by the forest itself. By the time darkness fully claimed the ridge, I was trapped. The sun had disappeared beyond the peaks, leaving me with only the tower's silhouette, cold and precise, etched against the night sky. Every path I took ended at the same base. The mountain had become a labyrinth. The tower, the center, and I, no matter how far I ran, was its prisoner. I set my pack against a rock, knees shaking, and listened. The wind carried nothing, only silence, pregnant and thick. I realized then that it wasn't just a loop of trees and trails. The mountain itself had intelligence. The ridge bent, twisted, shaped by a will I could not understand. The tower had drawn me in, teaching me that escape wasn't a choice. Not yet. And as I crouched there in the fog, I understood one terrifying certainty. I would climb the tower again. The mountain had made it inevitable. The sun's last light faded, and with it, every shred of rational thought. The night was mine now, and the ridge waited. Patient, silent, and eternal. I returned to the tower at first light, boots crunching the frost-covered dirt at the base. The sun had not yet burned the lingering mist from the ridge, and the air carried the sharp scent of cold metal and wet pine. Every instinct told me to wait, to avoid climbing, to retreat, but I needed to know. I needed to see the source of what had followed me through the mountain's impossible loops. The lower steps were slick with dew, yet they bore impressions of fresh weight. Someone or something had been here after me. My fingers traced the metal railings, and the chill of the steel seemed to thrum beneath my touch. A low vibration, like distant footsteps, just beyond hearing. I could feel the tower settling, or perhaps it was watching, waiting for me to make the first move. I climbed steadily, each step echoing through the hollow frame. The hollow metallic resonance carried with it a strange sensation, as if the tower itself had lungs and was exhaling around me. Dust motes floated in shafts of sunlight through the rusted gaps, and I imagined faces flickering in their dance, though none appeared. At the upper landing, I paused. The floorboards were empty, silent, except for the deep gouges etched into the beams. I crouched, examining them closely. Each mark was deliberate, ragged yet precise, as if the metal and wood had been clawed with intent. The splintered wood smelled of fresh sap, an odor impossibly alive despite the tower's age. It made no sense. There was no way anything of normal size could have reached that high, and yet the marks told a story of force, of persistence. A shiver ran up my spine. The tower beneath me trembled once, not with wind, not with the forest, but with a subtle, singular pulse. Dust fell from the rafters in slow motion, yet there was no gust to carry it. I swallowed, pressing my hands to the railings, feeling the vibration thrumming through my arms. Something had been up here moments before, or perhaps was still, just beyond perception. I moved carefully across the platform, each footstep measured. The silence pressed against my ears, only interrupted by the distant calls of birds that seemed wrong, off-key, or too early for the hour. A loose board groaned beneath my weight, and I froze. The marks on the beams appeared to twist, almost imperceptibly, as if the wood itself were remembering my presence and reshaping the gouges in response. The sky above was pale, sunlight filtering unevenly through rusted girders, casting long angular shadows across the deck. I looked down, expecting to see the base of the tower as normal. Instead, I saw the shadows stretch impossibly, elongating toward me with a fluid motion, as though the tower's shape was bending around me. My stomach churned. I should have felt panic, but instead there was a cold clarity. Whatever had made those marks had not only observed me, it had learned from me. I traced the gouges with my fingers, noting the depth, the curvature. The wood was warm, too warm. I stepped back, heart hammering, and felt the floor beneath me quiver, not like a tremor, but like a heartbeat. Slow, deliberate, waiting. I realized with a creeping horror that the tower was no longer inert. It had become an extension of whatever had been shadowing me, a conduit, a mirror of presence. I pressed myself against the railing, every sense straining. The wind was still, the forest below quiet, but I could hear something faint. A scratching, subtle at first, then deliberate. Not across the boards, but through the beams themselves, the metal frame thrumming as if alive. The scratches formed rhythms, patterns I could almost interpret, like something tracing the shape of me, learning the angles of my reach, the weight of my steps. I backed toward the upper platform, scanning the rafters, the hollow spaces, the beams above. Every shadow seemed to shift in response, subtle enough to be brushed aside by rational thought, but undeniable. The world had stopped being static. It had become a reflection, a recording, a shape that learned and waited. And then the tower trembled again, stronger this time. The vibration surged through my feet, up my legs, rattling my teeth. Dust and splinters fell like snow. I froze, sensing a presence, something massive moving just above me, concealed yet precise. I wanted to look up, but a primal instinct held me in place. Whatever had made these marks was waiting for my next action. The tremor subsided as quickly as it had begun, leaving a quiet so dense it pressed against my ears. I exhaled slowly, realizing my chest ached, not from exertion but from the awareness that I was being studied, that this was no accident. The tower was not empty. It had been inhabited by a presence that observed, adapted, and followed. I knew then that daylight offered no protection, that the forest and the mountain were extensions of it, and that I was nothing more than a subject to its curiosity. And far below, the tower seemed to hum softly, as if acknowledging that I had understood, acknowledging that it had learned. I could feel it in the tips of my fingers, in the soles of my boots, in the shallow pulse of my own heartbeat. The tower had become a mirror of me, and I was already part of its record. Whatever waited in the rafters had left its message, its shape, its intent. And when darkness returned, faster than I expected, heavier than any night I had ever known. The sun had dipped behind the ridge, leaving the tower a jagged silhouette against a bleeding sky. The forest around me was quiet, too quiet. The normal creaks of trees and distant bird calls swallowed by the growing shadow. Even the wind had retreated, leaving only a cold, pressing air that settled against the glass of the tower's windows. I climbed back inside, boots tapping lightly against the hollow metal frame, trying to convince myself I was still in control. Each step echoed unnaturally, bouncing back off the beams, returning as something warped, distorted. At first, I thought it was just the acoustics, the metal humming with age. But then I felt it, the weight behind my shoulder, a presence that should not exist. The voice came next, not an echo, not a distant murmur bouncing through the hollow frame. It whispered directly behind me, soft, deliberate, a breath brushing across the nape of my neck. Each word was human, familiar, shaped from memory. Names, fragments of conversations I had long forgotten, details from fire seasons, decades past. The familiarity was worse than fear. It was the violation of something intimate, private, turned inside out. I spun around, heart hammering, expecting someone or something to be there. Nothing. Just the darkness, pressing in from the corners, still and dense. My breath fogged in the cold air, and for a moment I thought I could hear it inhaling. Not the rasp of wind, not the sigh of the forest, but a measured, deliberate inhale. Patient, learning. I backed away slowly, scanning the floor and rafters, counting every beam, every shadow. The whispering stopped as soon as I moved my eyes, as though it depended on me looking elsewhere. When I turned again, a soft exhalation brushed past my ear, a deliberate rhythm that mirrored my own heartbeat. It was learning me, tracing me, marking my movements like a predator calibrating its strike. The air grew thick, heavy with metallic tang and damp dust. Each footstep I took across the platform seemed to echo longer, stretch further, returning to me in patterns I couldn't anticipate. It mirrored my pace, slowing when I slowed, halting when I paused, then starting again when I forced myself forward. I realized with a creeping horror that this presence wasn't just following. It was anticipating, rehearsing, shaping itself around me. I gripped the railing tightly, knuckles whitening. My eyes darted to the windows, where the last light clung to the frame, reflecting the forest outside. But the reflection wasn't right. Something shifted in the glass, a shape behind me that shouldn't have been there. I turned, and the space was empty, yet the sense of being watched, of being mirrored, intensified. The whispers returned, closer now, threading into my thoughts, teasing knowledge only I possessed. Names, places, events, things I never spoke aloud, slipped from the air like smoke, curling around my ears. I tried to speak, to test it, but no sound emerged. The tower seemed to anticipate my words before they formed, twisting around my intent. And then I heard it inhale again, slow, deep, calculated. Not a human breath, yet frighteningly human in cadence. I froze, hearing the faint shift of weight above me, a subtle scrape along the beams, as though whatever occupied the rafters was moving to watch. Learning, shaping itself to fit my form. I realized then that it was no longer an echo, no longer a simple shadow. It was taking me in, cataloging every motion, every reflex, every instinct I had relied upon, every familiar movement I had performed in towers like this for decades was now being studied, memorized. The thought made my stomach knot. I was no longer alone, and I was already part of something else's design. I stepped back, breath shallow, the whispering stopping as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was deeper than the any I had known, an oppressive void, pressing against my chest. The tower shivered once, the glass panes rattling softly, dust dancing in the minimal light. I could feel it there, behind me, around me, aware of me in a way no human ever could be. I knew I couldn't leave, not yet. Every instinct screamed to descend, to escape the tower, to flee the ridge. But the moment I thought it, I felt the walls tighten, subtly, impossibly, as though the frame itself had contracted around my awareness. The presence had learned not just my body, but my fear, my hesitation, my thoughts. I crouched, pressing my hands against the cold metal, trying to steady my heartbeat. The whispers had gone, replaced by a low, deliberate inhalation, slow and measured. I knew that when it spoke again, it would know more than I could bear, shaping the night, the tower, and perhaps me, into something unreadable, something entirely its own. I stayed there until the first tendrils of moonlight crept over the ridge, illuminating the upper beams. The tower was silent, but I felt it everywhere, in the air, in the metal, in the echo of my own breath. It had learned me, and I had no choice but to return to the platform above. The night had grown too heavy to ignore, and whatever waited in the rafters was no longer just a presence. It was patient, it was deliberate, and it had already begun to become the shape of me. The air was heavier than ever as I climbed, each step on the metal stairs reverberating like a warning. My hands gripped the railing until my knuckles ached and my breath came shallow staccato, fogging in the chill that had settled inside the tower. Every sound I made seemed to stretch, linger, return to me warped and distorted, echoing against the beams in ways I couldn't account for. The night was complete, but I felt something above me, something waiting, aware, patient. A soft glow appeared on the upper landing, subtle at first, like a candle seen through fog. I froze mid-step, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was a reflection, a trick of the old metal and moonlight. But as I stared, the light pulsed slightly, almost breathing, and I realized it was something alive, or at least pretending to be, something that watched me with intent I couldn't read. The shape came into view, a silhouette that resembled someone I had known, someone I had trusted, right down to the stance, the tilt of the head, the way the shoulders hunched slightly forward. My chest tightened. Memory clawed at memory, recollections of past seasons, old warnings, the camaraderie of someone I thought long dead. It moved like them, but wrong, deliberate in a way that was unnervingly precise, like it was testing me. I ascended cautiously, each step deliberate, measuring the distance, forcing my eyes not to wander. The glow intensified slightly, and I could make out the face, almost, but not quite human. Too smooth, too symmetrical, almost as if someone had molded it from memory rather than flesh. My stomach twisted as I realized it knew me, knew exactly what I expected to see. And yet it was wrong in the smallest, most fundamental ways. It tilted its head toward me as I climbed, watching my approach, adjusting itself, learning me still. The stairs felt longer than they should, each step stretching the space, elongating the tower as though it existed partly outside normal geometry. I could hear the faint whispering again, low, threading through the beams, reminding me of what I had felt the night before. Every detail of my movements, my posture, even my hesitation, it catalogued, memorized, replicated. I reached the final platform and stopped. The figure was closer now, illuminated in that soft glow, its features a distorted reflection of someone I had once trusted. I realized with a cold certainty that it had been observing me the whole time I thought I was learning the tower. Now it had learned me. Now it could move in ways I couldn't anticipate. Then it smiled. Not the smile of a human, but the reconstructed memory of one. A mouth, shaped from recollection, accurate to the minutest detail, yet utterly alien. It carried neither warmth nor intent, just the echo of recognition and the absence of life. I felt my knees buckle, the world narrowing to the metallic echo of my boots, the breathing of the air, and the impossible, deliberate gaze of that face. I stepped forward, compelled, trapped between fear and a desperate curiosity, and the smile widened imperceptibly. The glow flared slightly, illuminating the upper beams where dust danced like motes in a phantom wind. My pulse throbbed in my ears. The tower seemed alive, the metal shivering, resonating as if responding to the figure above me. It mirrored my anticipation, my dread, my every movement. The whispering returned, closer now, threading around me, brushing the nape of my neck, weaving memories into sound. It repeated my own thoughts, my own fears, shaping them into something palpable. I could feel the heat of it, the pressure of its attention, and a single, sickening realization hit me. This was no longer a shadow, no longer an echo, no longer the tower. It had taken the shape of what it knew, and now it had my form in its mind. The smile stretched further, subtly, impossibly, the lips bending in ways human jaws never could. I stumbled back, catching myself on the railing, and the figure's posture shifted to match my motion. It was learning, adapting, calibrating. I could see the smoothness of its skin, the absence of pores, the faint glimmer of memory twisted into flesh. And then, in a moment of impossible stillness, it tilted its head again, regarding me with a patience that outlasted time itself. I realized I had no options left. I couldn't flee down the stairs. Each step felt monitored, measured. The glow dimmed slightly, and I understood then that it had chosen this moment to assert presence, to test the final threshold. My mind raced, grasping for rationality, for explanation, for some small foothold in the impossible. There was none. I was trapped on the upper landing with a facsimile of memory, a construct that had observed, learned, and now existed only to reflect me back in ways that were both familiar and horrifying. And then it smiled once more. This time, the motion was deliberate, exaggerated, almost triumphant. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak, feeling every instinct to survive dampened by the certainty that the entity had not only learned me, it had replaced the familiar with its own design. It wasn't just a shape, it was a teacher, a mimic, a predator that knew me better than I knew myself. The glow faded slightly, leaving the face in partial shadow, the smile lingering like a promise. I realized with a chilling certainty that the tower itself had been a conduit, a classroom, a rehearsal, and I had been the subject. The last thing I remember, before I stumbled backward, heart hammering, was the sense that it was still watching, still waiting, still learning, and that the face above me could appear anywhere, at any time, shaped from memory, precise, perfect, and utterly alien. The tower was silent then, but the knowledge of it lingered, a presence embedded in the air, the beams, the echoes of my own heartbeat. I had glimpsed the final shape of something that had learned to be me, and I would never be alone in that mountain again. They said the road wasn't meant for strangers. We laughed when the gas station attendant warned us, his hands trembling slightly as he pointed down the fog-choked forestry road. "Mile marker 17, he said. and didn't stop. But the sun was low, burning orange behind the hills, and we'd come this far. Turning off the main highway, we plunged into the ridgeline fog, the kind that swallows everything but the road beneath your tires. The trees leaned closer with each mile, their branches scraping the sides of the truck like fingernails over bone. The map insisted this path existed, but the road seemed narrower than it should, overgrown in places, rocks jutting through where pavement had cracked and faded. Every mile, swallowed by mist, made the air colder, heavier, as if the fog itself weighed on the cab. I could hear the truck's engine thrum differently here, each vibration stretched, echoing off the hillsides in slow waves. It was quieter, though. The birds, the wind in the pines, even the occasional distant car on the highway seemed gone, as though the world itself had paused for our trespass. We passed hollowed-out stumps and old tree trunks, gnarled and moss-covered, and the dirt under the tires was damp, sticky, leaving impressions that vanished behind us almost immediately. The further we drove, the more the road felt like it didn't want us to be there. And then we saw it. Mile marker 17, leaning and faded, splintered wood, showing dark streaks, like the road had been carved with tears. We pulled the truck to a stop, and the fog seemed to press against the windows. Every sound halted. The wind, the insects, even the low growl of the engine when it idled. Silence wasn't just quiet. It was waiting. A single tap echoed somewhere inside the truck. Soft, almost apologetic. Too deliberate to be a branch scraping the cab. My hand froze on the gear shift. My brother glanced at me, eyes wide in the dim light from the dashboard. He had heard it too. We didn't move. The tap came again, from the roof, near the back, a hollow, echoing thump that resonated like a small drum. Not enough to frighten immediately, just enough to make your muscles tense, your stomach hollow. I tried to rationalize it, branches brushing the roof, a loose panel vibrating in the wind. But there was no wind. The fog was still, thick, unnerving, pressing on the truck from every side. The heater rattled briefly, its hum breaking into an irregular pattern, then dying down again. It wasn't the kind of noise a mechanical part makes. It was testing. It was listening. I opened the door to lean out, thinking maybe some animal had wandered near, and the mist rolled over me in a sudden wall of damp cold. The forest beyond the headlights was indistinct, shadows melding into the grey whiteness, shapes forming, then vanishing, the second I tried to focus on them. The tap sounded again inside, echoing the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Or maybe it was my heartbeat, echoing the tap. I couldn't tell. We laughed nervously, trying to shake it off. "It's just the truck settling," I said, voice tight. But the words sounded wrong, hollow, swallowed almost instantly by the fog. The longer we sat, the more I noticed the way the silence pressed on us, folding in on the cab. Even the radio, which we hadn't turned on, emitted a faint crackle at irregular intervals, like it was trying to speak. Static forming whispers that dissolved the second we listened. The mile marker leaned further, impossibly, as though inching toward the truck. I blinked, and it was normal again. Straight against the earth. My brother's hand tapped nervously on the dash. The tap inside, repeated slower this time, deliberate, purposeful. Our breaths fogged in the cab, despite the heater, swirling in short, panicked bursts. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it moving around us, shaping the fog, listening. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't leave either. The road had swallowed the rest of the world, leaving us suspended in a narrow strip of earth between the mile marker and the trees. Each tap reminded us that we weren't alone, that the fog wasn't just mist, it was a presence, patient, waiting, aware of every slight movement, every shallow breath. And somewhere beyond the windshield, something unseen had already stepped onto the road beside us. We turned off the main highway that afternoon, the sun dragging low across the Tennessee hills, burning orange and gold behind the ridgelines. The last gas station sat like a relic, pumps long rusted, the windows streaked with dirt and fingerprints that weren't ours. The clerk gave us a look that didn't quite leave his face even after we'd left. He warned us about the forestry road ahead, something about mile marker 17. Don't stop, he said. Don't even think about it. We laughed, of course. We were young, eager for the kind of adventure that smelled faintly of old leaves and gasoline, unaware that warnings often carry the weight of things seen and remembered, not meant for the living. The road narrowed as soon as the pavement ended. The map promised a clear path, but the trees seemed to curve inward, forming a tunnel of green and grey mist. Branches scraped the sides of the truck, the sound like fingernails over thin metal. Gravel crunched unevenly beneath the tires. Every bump seemed magnified, echoing off the hills in strange patterns, like the forest itself was listening, holding its breath as we pressed forward. The fog thickened, hugging the road, filling the cab with damp, cold air that smelled faintly of wet pine and earth. At first it was just quiet, ordinary quiet, the kind you notice when the birds stop singing, when the wind doesn't stir the leaves. But then I realized the quiet was unnatural. It had texture, a density that pressed against my skin, wrapping around my chest, making every breath feel heavier. My brother shifted in the passenger seat, unconsciously adjusting the map on his lap. He didn't speak. Neither did I. We saw the leaning wooden marker before the fog fully swallowed it. Mile marker 17. The wood was darkened with age, splintered, leaning slightly as though it had grown tired of standing upright. Moss climbed its edges, wet and slick. The truck slowed as we approached. Every instinct told me to stop, yet we rolled forward, pulling the brakes gently as if the road itself demanded caution. The fog thickened around the marker, curling upward in slow spirals that obscured the forest beyond, and for a brief moment, the world beyond the cab ceased to exist. And then it happened, a faint tap, soft, almost delicate, from somewhere inside the truck. Not the roof, not the doors, not a loose panel. Somewhere impossible. I froze, hand on the wheel, feeling the vibration of the engine against my palms. My brother's eyes met mine in the dim dashboard light, and I knew he had heard it too. The tap came again, slower this time, deliberate, hollow. It echoed in the cab, like a heartbeat, pressed against glass. I tried to rationalize it, branches maybe brushing the roof, but the fog was still. Not a leaf stirred, not a sound beyond the thump of the tap and the idling engine. Each tap carried a weight, a message I couldn't decipher, a rhythm that mimicked the pull of fear itself. The air turned colder suddenly, sharply, making my breath visible in the cab. The mist seeped through the windows, curling around our arms, slipping down the gaps in the doors. The road behind us disappeared completely. The tires no longer pressed against familiar gravel. Shapes emerged from the fog just long enough to vanish. Shadows that didn't belong to trees or stumps or rocks. I turned my head, slow, careful, scanning the cab. Everything was as it should be. But the weight of being watched pressed on me, tangible, almost breathing against the back of my neck. I opened the door just a crack to peer out, and the fog rolled in like water, damp against my skin. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but I stayed, captivated, unable to look away. That's when I noticed it. The air near the marker seemed to shimmer, subtle, like heat off asphalt, but wrong, colder. A shape moved just beyond the edge of visibility, not fully formed, not fully gone. The tap came again, synchronized with my heartbeat this time, matching it perfectly. We didn't speak. There was no need. Words could not carry the weight of what we felt. The forest seemed to lean closer, pressing the fog into the cab, wrapping around us in a slow, suffocating embrace. The leaning marker swayed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging us, welcoming us, or warning us. We sat there, frozen, listening, until the first thin streaks of dusk light finally caught the edges of the trees. And even then, the tap lingered, echoing somewhere inside the truck, a reminder that we were not alone, not really. That night, the road behind us disappeared completely into fog. The trees around the cab were silent, their presence oppressive, patient, and the tapping, soft and precise, continued, a rhythm that promised we had crossed some invisible boundary, one where maps, warnings, and reason held no weight. Night fell quickly over the ridge. The fog had grown thick, swallowing the distant hills and muting of the forest to a heavy, colorless gray. Inside the cab of the truck, we leaned back against the worn seats, trying to convince ourselves the day had been just an ordinary drive, nothing more. But the air had shifted. Cold seeped in through cracks in the door and windows, brushing our skin in wet, clammy fingers, and even with the heater running, it carried a weight, a presence we could feel, pressing silently against our backs. The interior lights flickered without warning. First a soft blink, then a pulse. Twice, like the truck itself was drawing a slow, careful breath. My brother glanced at me, his eyes narrow, but he didn't move. Neither did I. The lights dimmed again, and the warmth of the cab felt fleeting, slipping into shadows that seemed thicker than mere night. A tapping began, soft at first, irregular, almost playful, but then it became deliberate, rhythmic. We turned our heads toward the source. The sound came from the front windshield, tapping against the glass on the inside, yet no one sat there. Neither of us had moved. The fog beyond the windshield swirled, twisting into ghostly shapes, a white haze blotting out the forest. And then, slowly, a faint pattern appeared across the glass, foggy breath marks, tracing slow circular smears that spiraled outward, curling like fingers searching for purchase. We shone our flashlights forward, beams cutting through the haze, trying to catch the intruder, or whatever it was. But both front seats remained empty. Our breaths formed clouds in the cab, mingling with the condensation, curling in tight loops before dissipating into nothing. Each time we exhaled, it seemed to stir the fog, making the faint patterns shift, moving slightly, as if something unseen responded to us. The tapping continued, precise and unyielding, echoing in the cab, bouncing against the metal frame like a heartbeat. It was patient, deliberate, testing. At moments, the rhythm mimicked our own heartbeats, and I realized I could feel it through the floor, through the seat beneath me. Every instinct screamed to open the doors and run, but the fog outside had become a wall, pressing against the glass, thick and silent, blocking the way back. I reached forward, hand trembling, to wipe the glass. The breath marks only spread, smearing into shapes that hinted at hands, fingers, faces pressed against the other side. And yet nothing was there. Nothing tangible. It was impossible, yet undeniable. The fog carried weight, and the light traced it like it had life. Every sound beyond the cab had disappeared. No animals called, no branches scraped against each other, not a single bird dared to disturb the thick, heavy night. The world outside had gone mute, as though we had crossed into some quiet, suspended corner where time itself paused to observe. And then, in that silence, a faint second tap arrived, precise, deliberate, answering the first. It echoed in the glass, bouncing between windshield and roof, a call and a response from nothing at all. We sat frozen. The truck became a cage of cold air and shadows, and the fog on the inside of the windshield thickened, swirling into slow spirals that seemed to lean toward us. Shapes formed in the condensation, circles, arcs, almost like eyes watching, following. My brother's hand brushed mine, and for the first time, he spoke without words. His grip tightened. The tapping stopped suddenly. The cab fell into absolute silence. Every muscle in my body tensed. I dared not breathe. The fog hung there, clinging to the glass, pulsing faintly, like a living, waiting thing. And then, slowly, a new smear appeared, far too deliberate to be a trick of condensation. It moved upward, curling toward us, pressing against the glass like a small, invisible hand. We didn't know what it wanted. We didn't know what it was, but we both knew we weren't alone, and we were running out of time before it decided to cross the final boundary, the one separating the living from whatever had claimed the cab as its own. The temperature dropped sharply, as though the ridge itself had exhaled a pocket of winter straight into the cab. Our breaths turned white instantly, curling and curling like smoke, filling every corner of the truck with ghosts of ourselves. Frost bloomed across the dashboard, delicate branching patterns spreading across the plastic and metal, crystallizing like veins reaching for us. The warmth we'd felt earlier evaporated, leaving only the bitter bite of cold and a sense that the air was thicker here than it should have been. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, tiny handprints appeared. Small, impossibly precise, pressing outward from the frost as if someone or something was trapped inside the glass, reaching toward us. We froze, staring at them, hearts hammering. They multiplied, scattering across the dashboard, crawling over the console, over the seats. The patterns moved in real time, inch by inch, weightless yet deliberate, as though climbing, inching closer. The cab felt smaller with each passing second. The frost lifted into dim relief beneath the faint glow of the flashlight, tracing shapes too small to be human, yet undeniably alive in their intent. Each print left a shallow dent, barely perceptible, yet undeniably there, forming tiny arcs and curves, advancing toward us across the upholstery like a tide of ice. Something stirred in the back of the cab. Not a shadow, not quite, but the faint impression of movement, an absence of air, a distortion, a subtle pressure creeping over the seats. The hair on my arms rose as I realized the prints weren't just marks. They were the beginning of a weightless crawl, something moving across the truck interior without sound, without substance, yet undeniably there. The cold pressed against our faces and hands, sharper now, biting and wet, carrying the faint scent of metal and earth, the kind of smell that clings after a sudden storm. Every exhale formed a tiny fog, rising, twisting with the frost, mingling with it, as if the cab itself were alive, breathing, shifting. The handprints continued their silent climb, moving with intent, pressing closer as if measuring, testing, learning the space between us and the door. the seats, the windows. I could see my brother's wide eyes reflected in the frost, mirrored and distorted as the prince crept up the console, across the dash, and toward our laps. Panic was rising, quiet but undeniable, squeezing the chest, tightening the throat. Every instinct screamed to bolt, to flee, yet the frost and the prince kept us frozen in place, drawn into a silent calculus of dread. And then a new pattern emerged. Lines connecting the prince, forming tiny spirals that seemed to pulse faintly in the glow of the dashboard lights. Something had begun, climbing over the upholstery, inch by inch, weightless, untraceable, reaching for the brothers in the back. Not a shadow, not a thing I could name, just the movement, deliberate, alive and aware. We sat, pressed against each other, unable to move, unable to breathe without stirring the shapes that crept closer. The frost shivered in faint, imperceptible waves, and the handprints continued their march. There was no knocking, no scratching, just the quiet, patient claim of something that should not exist inside a locked truck, moving toward us with purpose. Waiting for the moment, we realized we were not alone. We didn't wait any longer. The rear door flung open, cold air stabbing at our skin, and we bolted down the unlit forestry road. The fog hung thick and low, glowing faintly white in the scant moonlight, as though the ridge itself had exhaled a pale warning. Every step was uncertain, the uneven gravel crunching underfoot, but the faint glow ahead gave the only sense of direction, just enough to keep moving. Behind us, the tapping returned. Faster now, sharper, frantic. Not on glass anymore, not restrained by the cab or the dashboard. It had moved, climbing the metal frame of the truck, striking at the metal like it was testing it, learning it, remembering how to make its presence known. The rhythm accelerated, almost pleading, almost angry, a pattern our minds strained to understand, echoing across the silent ridge. Suddenly the truck lights sparked on for a single moment, harsh and unnatural. The frost inside scattered like disturbed breath, twisting and curling in chaotic arcs, and in that instant we glimpsed it. A shape, dark and wrong, coiled across the cab interior. It wasn't solid, not in the way anything should be solid, but it moved with purpose, as if it had weight and momentum, yet no substance. The image burned into the back of my eyes before the lights died again. Darkness swallowed the ridge in one gulp, leaving only the hiss of our breaths and the uneven thud of our footsteps. We stumbled, nearly colliding with each other as the road twisted beneath our feet, barely a path through the dense fog. Every shadow seemed to flicker at the edge of perception, every whisper of wind carrying a suggestion of movement behind us. The tapping didn't stop. It chased, echoing, mocking, circling. It was patient, clever, intelligent, in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck bristle. The ridge stretched on endlessly. Every bend, every dip seemed wrong. Too sharp, too sudden, curving like the forest itself, had learned to trap us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, seeing nothing yet, feeling everything pressing close, crawling over the earth like the unseen hands in the frost back in the truck. My brother's breathing was loud in the night, ragged, and I realized mine must be worse, yet somehow we both forced our legs to move faster. Then the fog brightened, a ghostly white glow pulsating from somewhere ahead, not far, but impossibly out of reach. And the tapping crescendoed, not on glass, not on metal, but now echoing across the ridge itself, like the air was striking, slapping, testing. My stomach turned cold as I glimpsed it again. Something wrong inside the cab. Something with no face yet unmistakable in its movement, twisting the frost into arcs and curls like smoke. The light faded. The tapping slowed to a deliberate, measured pulse, a countdown we didn't understand. The ridge stretched on, endless and waiting, and every instinct screamed that we were not just running down a road, we were running through something that had already been waiting for us, something that knew our names and the rhythm of our steps. And in that darkness, the roads seemed to loop just enough to confuse, to disorient, as if the forest itself was learning how to trap us here, waiting for the next tap, the next move, the moment we realized the fog was alive. By sunrise, the ridge seemed ordinary again, almost polite. The fog had lifted, leaving the old forestry road slick with dew, the air crisp and harmless in the morning light. We returned with a tow driver, someone local, someone who wouldn't even step past the tree line. He stayed back, eyes flicking nervously toward the ridge, hands tight on the wheel, refusing to see what we already knew was there. The truck sat where we had abandoned it the night before. Frost now melted into streaks, handprints smeared and curling like ink in water. Nothing had been touched, yet the evidence remained. Every mark, every smear, whispered a silent warning, an imprint of presence that shouldn't have been possible. The frost had become a map of something we couldn't read, climbing across the dash, onto the seats, fading only when we approached. And then, my gaze shifted to mile marker 17. The leaning wooden post we had laughed at, the one that had seemed harmless under the fog's veil. It was gone. Overnight, as if swallowed by the forest itself. In its place, a stone marker had risen, freshly carved. The soil around it, still unsettled and soft. Its edges were sharp against the morning light, cutting into the landscape like a scar. 2 names were etched into the stone. Our names. My brother's and mine, pressed deep enough to catch shadows in the grooves, permanent and unyielding. The air felt heavier around it, thicker as though the forest held its breath again, waiting to see if we would notice. The tow driver refused to go closer, muttering about stories older than he cared to repeat. He said nothing could return once the ridge decided it wanted you. We didn't argue. The stone didn't need witnesses. It simply waited. As we drove away, the ridge seemed to shift behind us, a lingering fog curling into the back of the truck bed, soft as smoke. And somewhere, just at the edge of hearing, I thought I could hear the faintest tapping, slow, deliberate, patient, like a reminder that some roads, some markers, are not meant to be left behind. Even now, I can feel it. A ridge that knows my name, a forest that keeps what it wants, and a stone marker, cold and unyielding, carved with proof that the line between us and the ridge had already blurred. The storm hit the ridge without warning, fierce and sudden, rattling the snow against my gear as if the mountain itself were striking me. I forced myself into a hollowed-out tunnel, carved naturally into the ice, its walls slick and cold under my fingers. The wind outside roared like a beast, yet inside the tunnel, a strange hush had settled. Everything felt muted, as though the ridge were holding its breath, and I could hear nothing but the faint hiss of my own breathing. I tried to convince myself that this was ordinary, that the snow had simply formed a quiet chamber. But then I heard it, a slow, dragging sound skimming along the tunnel ceiling. Not the sharp crack of ice settling, not the scrape of shifting snow. This was deliberate, heavy, measured. The noise moved in rhythm with the slope above me, lingering directly where I lay, Every instinct screamed to move, but my body refused. The ceiling sagged imperceptibly, just enough to make my pulse stutter, as though whatever was up there knew exactly where I had placed myself. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear anything more than that deliberate scrape, but its presence pressed into me like the cold itself. The snow above remained unnaturally still everywhere else, untouched. The dragging paused right above my chest. I lay frozen, caught in the suspended silence, feeling the weight of something watching, testing, waiting, and then, without warning, it slid away. The tunnel returned to quiet, but the air felt thick, expectant, as if the storm outside was not the only danger and the ceiling above had just learned my shape. I kept my headlamp trained on the ceiling, willing it to stay still, but the light caught something that made my chest tighten. The ice above me wasn't uniform. It moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a swell formed, a subtle bulge, traveling across the tunnel roof, inch by inch, following a path that seemed aware of me. It wasn't cracking or breaking. It flexed like thin, frozen skin, stretching without resistance, gliding from one end to the other as if something heavy, yet fluid, passed just beneath. Every nerve in my body tensed. I tried to reason it away. Snow shifting under pressure, ice thawing and refreezing, but the pattern was too deliberate, too precise to be natural. The bulge paused above my face, almost as if inspecting me, lingering so close that I could feel the cold radiate down like a hand brushing over my cheek. My breath caught in my throat, visible in the lamplight, swirling toward the ceiling. I dared not move. Any twitch of muscle might draw attention. Then, as abruptly as it appeared, the bulge withdrew. The tunnel returned to its eerie silence. My heartbeat thudded against my ribcage in the still air. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening for anything, dragging, scraping, sighing, but the tunnel offered nothing. Only the wind outside screamed, while the ice above held its secret, waiting. By first light, I crawled from the tunnel and pulled myself onto its roof, expecting to find deep, obvious tracks, anything that might explain the drag of the night. But the snow was unnervingly smooth, pristine, as if untouched. Only long, shallow hollows marked the surface, too precise to be animal prints, too patterned to be wind. Something had moved beneath the crust, carving its path without leaving a trace. I took cautious steps down the ridge, each boot sinking slightly into the thin snow crust. The dragging sound returned, not behind me, but underfoot, keeping pace. The rhythm matched my stride, though I couldn't see its source. The snow shivered beneath each step, tiny pulses that vibrated through the soles of my boots, as if the mountain itself were alive and testing me. I tried to keep my pace steady, telling myself it was a creaking ice layer, a shifting ridge, but the precision of it unnerved me. Each pulse seemed conscious, calculated, deliberate, aware of my weight and rhythm. When I glanced back, the tunnel sat like a hollow wound in the ridge, silent, empty. Yet the memory of the bulging ceiling lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, following, just beneath the surface, waiting for me to misstep. I reached the tree line, each branch scraping my jacket like distant fingernails. The ridge stretched out behind me, quiet now, almost unnaturally so. Against the horizon, I forced myself to glance back at the tunnel, just once. Beneath its midpoint, the snow sagged suddenly, forming a wide depression that hadn't been there moments before. The hollow widened slowly, and from it came a subtle pulse, like a lung drawing air beneath ice and stone. It inhaled and exhaled with a rhythm that felt almost alive, each movement deliberate and impossibly controlled. Before I could step closer, the cavity collapsed inward, snow folding over itself with a muffled roar, sealing the void entirely. The dragging stopped. The tunnel looked inert, untouched, frozen. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It pressed against me, patient, watching, as if waiting for me to return to its snowbound maw. I forced my legs forward, shaking with the cold and the memory of what I had seen. Every crunch of snow underfoot sounded too loud, echoing like footsteps belonging to something far larger, something hidden just beneath the ridge. I dared not look back again. The road had narrowed to nothing more than dirt and roots swallowed by pines that leaned like they were eavesdropping. I spotted it just as the sun dipped low. A chapel, small and stooped, half hidden behind a tangle of overgrown trees. Its windows were dark, but something about it drew me closer, as though the forest itself had made room for it. Stepping inside, the air shifted, heavy and motionless. There was no echo, no creak of floorboards under my boots, not even the whisper of wind through cracks. It was a silence that pressed against the skin, as if the walls had swallowed sound itself. The pews stretched in rows, each one carved with hundreds of names. The wood bore them like scars, precise and deliberate, and some looked older, worn by decades. My eyes were drawn forward to the front row. Entire names had been gouged out violently, the cuts deep and ragged, the emptiness staring back like a wound. I crouched slightly, tracing a finger along the nearest carved letters. The gouges were jagged, angry, not the work of time or careless hands. Something had taken them, and whatever it had done so with intention. The chapel waited in that silent stillness, and I realized that whatever had carved these names, it was still here. I leaned closer to the scratched-out names, tracing the overlapping cuts with my eyes. The letters twisted and collided, fragments of words that didn't quite make sense, as if someone or something had tried to rewrite the history of the pews. The air shifted, subtle at first, like the weight of something moving just beyond perception. Soft creaks echoed beneath me, the wood bending under a step that wasn't mine. I froze, heart tightening, listening. Each step forward seemed to invite another response from the floorboards, a whispered warning that the chapel was aware of my presence. Moving carefully between the pews, I noticed the carvings seemed arranged in a strange, deliberate order. The names weren't random, they formed patterns I couldn't decipher, loops and spirals that pulled the eye unnaturally toward the altar. Every time I tried to look away, the rhythm of the chapel demanded attention. Then a knock rose from beneath the floorboards, a single, hollow tap that made my bones ache. It stopped me mid-step, a message in a language I didn't know but instinctively understood. Do not move. The chapel waited, breathing softly through the wood, and I knew the silence outside had nothing on the quiet inside these walls. I moved cautiously across the aisle, each step measured against the rhythm of the chapel's own pulse. Then it came again, the knock. Same rhythm as before, deliberate and hollow, as if the floor itself had learned my heartbeat. Curiosity edged over fear. I tapped the wood experimentally, once, twice, 3 times, and the floor answered immediately, perfectly mimicking the pattern. The sound seemed almost intelligent, deliberate, like something beneath the boards was listening, studying, learning. I whispered a cautious greeting into the empty room, words that felt foolish and small in the vast silence. Then it happened. A single heavy knock right beneath me, echoing through the floor like it had waited decades for someone to speak first. The chapel shifted in subtle ways. Dust stirred along the edges of the pews. Shadows deepened unnaturally, stretching toward me in slow, curling fingers. Every instinct screamed to leave, but I stayed, drawn by the impossible intelligence in the response, trapped in a dialogue with whatever existed below. The floor remained silent for a long, impossible moment. Then, a soft tapping began again, slower this time, deliberate, like a heartbeat counting down. The knocking grew deliberate, 3 slow taps whenever I moved or spoke. It wasn't random anymore, it was responding, patient, calculated, almost alive. I knelt carefully, pressing my palm against the floorboards. A faint vibration shivered through my fingers, subtle at first, then stronger, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the chapel, steady and ominous. I could feel it echo up my arm, into my chest, sinking with my own racing pulse. Every instinct screamed to run, yet the presence held me in place, tethered to the floor by some invisible gravity. The air thickened, the scent of cold wood and old dust clung to my nostrils, the silence of the chapel heavier than any storm I'd ever known. Nightfall pressed against the stained glass windows, dimming what little light remained. Shadows stretched unnaturally, slithering across the pews like they had weight, like they were watching me. I tried to rise, hoping to escape, but the floor responded. Suddenly, a full-body thud reverberated beneath me, echoing through every bone in my body, knocking the breath out of me. I froze, staring down at the floor, convinced that it had moved. Not under me, not beneath me, but with me. The rhythm of the knocking shifted, faster now, closer, circling. The chapel waited in suffocating silence for my next move. I couldn't tell if it wanted me to stay or if it was ready to trap me forever. The clock struck 12, and the air shifted violently, as if the chapel had inhaled all at once. The doors slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the ancient wood, sealing the room in darkness. Dust hung motionless in the sudden stillness, illuminated only by sparks igniting along every candle in a domino line of fire, flickering across the carved pews. Shadows stretched long, impossibly long, curling around the walls and across the floor. They did not obey the shapes of their objects. They writhed independently, reaching toward me like silent fingers. The space felt alive, expanding and contracting, as though the chapel itself was breathing. At the altar, something dark flickered, a shadow that wasn't quite a figure, yet wasn't nothing. It moved with subtle jerks, like it remembered shapes from memory, but lacked substance to hold them fully. Every instinct told me to run, yet my feet felt glued to the floor, my chest tightening against the oppressive weight of the air. A whispering seemed to rise from everywhere at once, soft, almost playful, yet edged with menace. The dark shape pulsed, flickering between the altar and the empty air around it. The chapel had changed. It was no longer a building, but a trap, a heartbeat synchronized, with something waiting, beneath the floor, behind the walls, inside the very air I breathed. And then a sudden silence fell, a quiet that pressed against my skull, waiting, patient, unyielding. Whatever had awakened in the chapel tonight, it was only beginning to learn my presence. I sank lower to the floor, my fingers grazing the cold wood behind the pulpit. An old iron ring caught my hand, rusted but stubborn, like it had been waiting for someone to pull it for decades. The instant I lifted it, the floor groaned a low, guttural sound that filled the chapel like a throat opening. A cold draught rose from the narrow opening, carrying with it the scent of earth and something older, decay and smoke, mixed with the sharp tang of carved wood. Inside, the cramped room was stacked with planks, each one bearing a carved name, letters perfectly etched and chillingly familiar. Every name matched one of the pews upstairs, including the gouged-out fragments I had studied earlier. The air was thick, almost viscous, pressing against my chest, as if the room itself was breathing. I reached a hand toward a plank, and the moment my fingers touched it, a faint vibration pulsed through the floor, not from the wood, but from beneath it, like the chapel was alive, sinking to my heartbeat. Something shifted in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the trapdoor. A sound scraped along the boards, slow, deliberate, as if testing the silence. The room smelled of smoke and wet timber, but no fire burned here, and no rain had reached inside. The names on the planks seemed to twist in the flickering candlelight, elongating and contracting in a rhythm that felt too deliberate, too knowing. I tried to pull back, but the iron ring rattled in my grasp, reluctant to release me. A whisper scraped across the floorboards beneath, soft yet insistent, echoing the cadence of my own shallow breaths. Whatever had carved these names, whatever had waited here for years, was awake now, and it had noticed me. We hiked into the forgotten quarry under a late afternoon sun, joking about echoes bouncing between the high sandstone walls. The cliffs rose like silent sentinels, their edges jagged against the fading light, and for a moment it felt like any other summer evening. Then a faint whistle drifted along the cliffs, too consistent to be wind. It answered our laughter and chatter with a precision that made my stomach tighten. We tested the acoustics, calling out, clapping, whistling back, but one note kept repeating exactly, even when no one made a sound. As dusk fell, the sun slipping behind the sheer rock, the whistle persisted, perfectly timed, always answering, never early, never late. It was as if the canyon itself had learned our rhythm, watching, practicing, waiting. I stopped mid-step, and the echo stopped too, leaving only the cold hush of sandstone. The walls loomed taller, their shadows stretching across the quarry floor. I realized then we weren't alone, not in the sense of another hiker or animal, but something was listening, learning, and waiting for the night to deepen. Night settled over the quarry, pulling a thick shadow over the sandstone walls. We sat near our small fire, trying to laugh it off, talking louder than we wanted, just to keep the echo from swallowing our words. The cold seeped in through jackets and jeans, sharp against our skin, and the wind's absence made every sound feel amplified. Then the whistle shifted, its pitch bent with our voices, its rhythm stretching to match the pauses we made. It was no longer a simple echo. It was learning, anticipating, practicing our timing, like some unseen teacher shaping a lesson we weren't meant to understand. When we fell silent, the quarry whistled first, a sound none of us had made, rising from somewhere that felt neither above nor behind us. The note stretched longer than any human could exhale, curling into the corners of the canyon, tugging at the edges of my senses. I stared at the fire, the shadows flickering across jagged rock, and realized we weren't just in the quarry. We were inside something alive, listening and waiting for the night to teach it more about us than we would ever want it to know. Trying to act braver than I felt, one of us lifted a trembling breath and whistled a long, rising tone. The sound hung in the canyon, vibrating off sandstone walls, then stopped. For a moment, silence returned, but it wasn't empty. The reply came, not from the cliffs, not from any wall we could see, but from right behind our circle. I spun toward the sound, firelight, trembling across our faces, and found only empty stone and drifting shadows. My stomach sank. Something had moved without moving. A handful of pebbles clattered down the cliffside, scattering across the loose gravel at our feet. The movement was deliberate, precise, as if some hidden presence had shifted its weight, just to let us know it was there. Each clatter echoed, layering over the whistled note, creating a rhythm we couldn't follow. I froze. My heart pounded louder than the wind, or whatever was out there. The canyon whispered around us, carrying the sound of our own breaths back at us in warped, unfamiliar timing. We were being studied, our courage measured against something that didn't belong in the daylight, something that had learned we could be afraid. The scrambling started suddenly, fast, uneven, like claws scratching against stone in bursts, too quick for any human to match. We shined our flashlights upward, trying to catch the movement, and for a moment I thought I'd glimpsed a figure. It didn't cling to the rock like a climber. Its limbs bent in impossible ways, darting diagonally across the cliff face as if gravity were optional. My breath froze in my chest, each exhale puffing into the chill night air that carried the faint whistle still answering us. Then it started again, layered tones, echoing from every direction at once. One note, split into two, then three, circling, rising, falling, weaving around us like wind with intention. We could feel it, listening, calculating, responding. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but the canyon held us in its hollow, unnatural rhythm. The creature was practicing, mimicking, learning from us. And when I caught the briefest glimpse of a shadow detaching itself from the cliff, I knew it wasn't just an echo anymore. It was something alive, waiting for the moment to descend. It emerged from a shadowed overhang, like the night itself had grown limbs. Its arms stretched long, the neck uncomfortably extended, jaw unhinging with every trill that slipped from its throat. The whistling, it wasn't random anymore. It matched our voices perfectly, twisting the tones of our own laughter and shouts into warped, sinister echoes. We froze, rooted to the rough stone beneath our boots, as it tilted its head, examining us the way a predator studies its prey. Each movement was deliberate, calculating which sound, which note, which breath it would mimic next. Then it stepped off the ledge. It didn't fall. The cliff was no obstacle. Its limbs flexed in ways that made no sense, letting it descend like a spider, scaling the air itself. The whistle followed, circling, drilling into the stone, pressing into our skulls. I realized, with a cold certainty, that it wasn't just echoing us. It was learning, shaping itself from our own sounds, preparing for the moment it would speak in our voices, and then perhaps take them. We ran, lungs burning, feet slipping on loose gravel as the narrow pass closed around us. The whistle followed, twisting through the cliffs from side to side, circling, layering, filling every crevice with its impossible mimicry. It wasn't just behind us. It was everywhere at once, in the air, in the stone, in our own ears. Something heavy landed somewhere near our ankles, kicking dust and pebbles like warning shots. One of us slipped, sliding toward the jagged drop, heart pounding in his throat. The cliffside seemed to reach for him. The creature was faster. It climbed down, like gravity didn't apply, its form fluid and inhuman, shadow and stone blending as it moved. The whistle rose to a high-pitched trill, vibrating through the canyon walls, like a signal. It had found its target. We scrambled, barely keeping our balance, hearts pounding, the echoing whistle dictating every step, reminding us the quarry itself had changed, become alive, listening, learning, waiting for the next mistake. And somewhere, just beyond sight, the thing moved, patient, precise, letting the canyon tremble with the knowledge that it had already won part of the game we didn't even know we were playing. Every night, I saw it, a faint red glow drifting over the creek, hovering like it knew exactly where I was. At first, I thought it was some trick of the fog, a reflection, or a lantern left by a passing boat. But it moved differently, deliberate, bobbing, teasing, like it was aware I was watching. Locals had warned me. Quiet words in the gas station or by the docks. Heads shaking, faces pale. Don't follow it, they said. Some who chase the light never come back. I laughed, told myself I wasn't afraid. That night, I stayed by the bank, lanterns in my boat, and on the dock, barely lighting the thick mist. The glow paused, almost examining me, then drifted closer than it ever had. The air grew colder, damp, clinging to my skin. I could hear the creak, but the fog swallowed every other sound. I wanted to turn back. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. But the lantern floated nearer, teasing me with its quiet red pulse. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just light. It was watching, waiting, testing me. Frustration clawed at me. I shouted at the lantern, demanded it leave, my voice cracking against the thick night. The fog seemed to answer. The red glow swelled, pulsing, spreading like a stain through the mist, filling every shadow with its unnatural light. Then I saw them. Dozens of faces pressed against the fog itself, blurred and twisting as if trapped inside the mist. Their mouths moved, silent screams that echoed in my chest. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, unsure if I was looking at some trick of my eyes or the lantern had gathered them somehow, collecting fear in shapes. The fog twisted with each pulse, drawing the faces closer, so close I thought they might step out of the air itself. The red light flared, burning my vision, and I froze. Somewhere behind me, the creek gurgled, but the normal sounds of night were gone. I realized, with a creeping, suffocating certainty, that the lantern wasn't just floating. It was alive in a way I couldn't name, and it was learning how I reacted, testing me. And when the faces swirled in unison, I understood. This night was far from over. The lantern jolted violently, its red light stabbing through the fog like a blade. Every shadow around the cabin writhed under its glow, and I felt the silent screams of the faces echoing in my skull. Though no sound reached my ears, my skin crawled as the light moved, drifting across the yard with a deliberate, almost taunting purpose. It hovered at the window, inches from my face, and I could feel its heat pressing against the glass. Handprints appeared slowly, impossibly smeared across the pane, half outside, half inside, like something had stretched through the fog itself to touch me. The cold of the night was nothing compared to the icy certainty settling in my chest. I tried to step back, but the lantern followed, floating closer with every movement. The fog twisted, folding around the red glow, and I realized I couldn't see the edges of it anymore. The world had been swallowed, leaving only the lantern and the faces pressed inside it, staring through me. The light pulsed, rhythmic and deliberate, as though counting, measuring. I knew Then, without thinking, that if I went outside, the lantern would follow. And if I stayed, it would come closer still. Learning. Always. Learning. Dawn finally bled through the fog, softening the night's sharp edges. The lantern was gone, vanished into the lingering mist, leaving the world unnervingly still. The yard smelled of wet earth and cold metal, and the fog seemed heavier, hanging closer to the ground, like it was waiting. I approached the window, hesitant, heart hammering. The glass bore the evidence of the night's terror, wet handprints smeared across the surface, as if something had pressed through from the outside, reaching in to touch me. Half of each print clung stubbornly to the pane, half dissolved into the morning light. The hollow weight of the house pressed down, emptier than before, quieter, and yet I could feel it, pulsing with a presence I could not name. I stepped back, feeling the chill creep up my spine. The lantern could return tonight, and the fog would rise to meet it, waiting for whoever dared follow its red glow. And I knew, deep down, no one would return. The quarry lay forgotten, tucked between high sandstone walls that had swallowed years of silence. The mine had been abandoned for decades, or so the locals said, though whispers of a missing miner kept the path alive in their stories. When I arrived, the entrance was blocked with rough boards and rusty padlocks, newer than the decay around them. It was as if someone or something had replaced them overnight, waiting. I pried the boards aside, the splintered wood groaning under my weight, and stepped into the tunnel. The air was dry but heavy, carrying a strange chill that crept up my neck, pressing against my lungs. Every step echoed oddly, like the shaft itself was listening, breathing in rhythm with me. Mining gear littered the walls, helmets, ropes, rusted picks left in disuse, yet the floor remained unnervingly clean. Shadows clung to the corners, yet shifted when I blinked, just at the edge of my vision. The deeper I went, the heavier the silence became, dense enough to feel like the mine was aware of my presence. Waiting for the moment, I realized I was no longer entirely alone. The tunnel stretched on, dark and narrow, the faint light from my headlamp barely cutting through the dust-laden air. Every step I took felt measured, deliberate, as though the earth itself was urging me forward or warning me to turn back. At the far end, the passage opened slightly, revealing a strange mound of dirt. It was shaped like a man, perfectly formed, impossibly symmetrical, every curve precise as if sculpted by an unseen hand. My camera felt heavy in my grip as I raised it, the flash illuminating the mound for a brief, revealing second. Then it moved. Not wildly, not like a living person, but it breathed, rising and falling with a subtle, deliberate rhythm. I stepped back, the walls behind me narrowing in my vision, pressing me forward towards something I did not want to see. My breath caught in my throat, and the chill in the tunnel deepened, seeping into my bones, as if the mine itself had exhaled at my presence. For a long moment, I simply stared, unable to decide whether to step closer or run. And in that hesitation, I felt the weight of eyes I could not see, pressing down through the darkness, waiting. The moment I turned to leave, the tunnel shifted. The walls seemed to lean inward, creeping closer with every careful step I took, and the ceiling pressed down, low and suffocating, as though the earth itself was alive, bending around me. Each movement felt exaggerated, the floor stretching beneath my boots, stretching time itself, until I wondered if I would ever reach the exit. Faint rattles came from the sides, mining tools scattered along the tunnel, but no one was there. The air smelled of dry dirt and something older, something waiting. My gaze flicked back to the mound. It had risen slightly, reshaping itself in subtle, unnatural ways. Contours of arms and legs twisted in impossible angles, almost human, almost not. I tried to step backward, and the passage seemed to stretch, the walls compressing around me like a throat about to swallow. My heart thumped as I realized the mine was no longer just a hollow space. It was a trap, narrowing, bending, alive. Every footfall echoed too long. Every inhale carried the weight of dust and whispers I couldn't yet understand. I forced myself forward toward the shifting mound, knowing that with every step, I was walking into something that had been waiting, something patient, silent, and impossibly old. The mound split with a dry, rasping sound, like brittle bone cracking beneath soil. Dust rose, thick and choking, curling around the tunnel in slow, suffocating spirals. From the dirt emerged a figure, gaunt and blackened, limbs bending at impossible angles. It wasn't alive like a man, but it moved with a rhythm that felt intentional, aware. Its mouth opened wide, and clouds of dust spilled out, carrying hundreds of disembodied voices, whispering, hissing, murmuring, names, warnings. Fragments I couldn't place, but each syllable made my chest tighten. My boots skidded against the floor as I stumbled backward, hands grasping for anything solid, any chance to escape. The walls seemed to pulse with it, closing in subtly, as though the tunnel itself were breathing in concert. I glanced at the mound, now fully awake, its body shifting unnaturally, contorting into shapes my mind refused to identify. Shadows stretched along the walls, flickering in impossible angles, echoing from the figure's movement. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet my legs felt rooted, trapped in the dust and the whispers that wrapped around my mind. I scrambled toward the entrance, tripping over scattered tools, coughing in the choking dust, feeling the figure move closer with deliberate, silent steps. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, clearer, like the earth itself was speaking, telling me I would not leave. Burst through the boards into the daylight, lungs burning, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might tear my chest open. The sun blinded me for a moment, but I didn't care. I ran, feet pounding over loose stones and dry leaves, barely noticing the sharp scrape of gravel under my hands as I fell once, twice, rising each time with raw desperation. Behind me, the tunnel's mouth sat still, silent. I dared a glance back, and every instinct screamed. Everything was as it should have been, yet completely wrong. The boards were nailed from the inside, neat and unbroken, no gaps, no trace of my entry. The earth seemed to have swallowed the mine whole, leaving nothing but the facade of closure. My mind kept hearing the whispers, faint at first, then rising in rhythm with my heartbeat. Names I didn't recognize, voices I shouldn't know, murmuring in every corner of my memory. They lingered as I stumbled down the ridge, tracing invisible paths, circling, watching. Even in daylight, the mine felt alive behind my eyes. I realized then that some things never stay buried, never remain in the darkness where you think you've left them. The earth can close, boards can seal, but certain shadows follow, breathing just behind you, waiting for the next step. We hiked deeper than either of us had intended, following a faint trail that wound between the ridges like a vein through the mountains. The forest thinned in patches, and there it was, a cabin, perfectly intact, sitting in a clearing that felt almost carved out of the wilderness itself. Every window faced away from the valley below, away from the open view, as if the structure were deliberately avoiding it. The air was still, heavier than it should have been, and even the birds seemed to skirt the edges of the clearing. I told myself it was just quiet up here, normal mountain silence, but the feeling pressed into my chest, subtle and sharp, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The cabin didn't just exist. It was waiting, aware. As we approached, the ground seemed too even, the lines of the cabin unnervingly precise. The boards were unweathered, though the surroundings had gone years without care. The smell of pine mingled with something colder, metallic, almost like copper, in the nose. I glanced at my daughter, and she looked back at me with wide eyes, sensing the same thing I did. This place was not meant to be stumbled upon, and yet here we were. I stepped closer to the door, feeling the wind shift as if it had noticed, felt the deliberate angles of the roof and walls, rejecting the natural flow of the mountains. A faint unease tugged at the edges of my mind, quiet but insistent, and I realized the cabin wasn't just in the forest, it was against it, separate, deliberate, waiting for someone to cross its threshold. The moment we stepped inside, the air shifted, colder than the forest outside, as though the cabin had been exhaling for decades just to meet us. Every mirror was turned toward the walls, reflecting nothing but bare wood and shadow. I felt a pull in my chest, the kind you don't notice at first, then can't ignore, like the room itself was aware of our presence and measuring it. My daughter laughed nervously, reaching to flip a mirror toward the center of the room, and I stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. There was a rhythm in the silence, subtle at first, a scraping just outside the walls, deliberate, slow. It followed the contours of the cabin, moving in a way no person could keep pace with. Every scrape echoed differently, as if the building itself were shifting, watching. I told myself it was the wind, the old boards settling, but the sound was too precise. It circled the structure, pausing at corners, then continuing, as if it knew we were inside. I could feel eyes pressing from the shadows, just beyond the mirrors, and even though the room was empty, I couldn't shake the sensation that the scraping wasn't on wood or stone, it was on flesh, measured, patient, waiting. The cabin wasn't just a building, it was an organism, silent but sentient, its interior arranged not for comfort, but for observation. Every movement we made seemed to tug at the mirrors, as if the walls themselves were recording, remembering, marking the moments. I glanced at my daughter again, and she mirrored my hesitation perfectly, frozen in the quiet dread that neither of us could yet name. The scraping continued, unwavering, and I realized then that leaving might not be as simple as turning toward the door. Something was circling, waiting for our next step, for the sound of our heartbeat to echo across the walls. The cabin was alive, and it knew we were inside. The scraping never stopped. It had become a language now, a deliberate rhythm along the exterior walls, slow and mechanical, yet impossibly alive. Each time I thought it might pause, it resumed, following the cabin's contours, as though mapping us, testing the edges of the space we dared to occupy. Inside, the air grew dense, colder than it should have been, and the silence outside pressed against the walls like a living weight. Every window seemed to distort reality, stretching and twisting the forest beyond into shapes that didn't exist. My daughter peered through one pane, and what she saw froze her blood. the interior reflected behind her eyes. Not the trees, the floorboards, the walls of the room where we actually stood. It was impossible, yet undeniable. We whispered to each other, words clipped and cautious, afraid the scraping might respond, might hear. The cabin was no longer passive. It was a predator in wait, counting our movements, gauging our fear. Shadows pooled in corners, elongating subtly, bending toward the mirrors that faced away from the world, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. And through it all, the scraping continued, patient, deliberate, almost sentient. I realized we were not observers here. We were part of an experiment, measured and mirrored, watched from angles that didn't exist. Each pulse of movement, each hesitant step we took, seemed to echo back at us in whispers we couldn't hear, but felt in our bones. By nightfall, we understood something crucial. The cabin wasn't just avoiding the outside. It was learning, waiting, and calculating. And whatever circled us in the walls was no longer content to remain unseen. The mirrors had begun to move on their own, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A shift here, a tilt there, until it became impossible to ignore. Each pane reflected the cabin's interior, but not the way it should have. Shapes lingered where they had no right to be, shadows stretching in directions that contradicted logic. Then I saw it. Behind the glass, something standing where we should have been. My daughter moved, and the mirrored figure mimicked her, but ever so slightly out of sync. A breath later, I stepped forward, and the shape lagged by the merest fraction, hesitant, deliberate, aware. It was learning, measuring, and somehow alive. We avoided the mirrors, glanced only when forced, but the images persisted, subtle and deliberate. Every reflection became a reminder that we were not alone, that the cabin was aware, and that it could reach into our perception. The space around us was narrowing, though the walls had not moved. The cabin itself had begun to twist reality, bending the world to its rhythm. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against our lungs, and each scrape along the exterior walls punctuated our unease. We were trapped within a maze of reflections, each one lying, each one observing. We had crossed the threshold from fear into something else entirely, a realization that the cabin's attention was focused on us, and it would not be satisfied merely with our presence. By the end of the night, the mirrors no longer faced the walls entirely. Their subtle shifts suggested calculation, as if the cabin were aligning itself, framing us, showing us exactly what it wanted us to see, and hiding what it did not. Night fell like a suffocating blanket, pressing the forest into silence while the cabin hummed with unseen movement. The mirrors, once reluctant, now shifted steadily on their own. One by one, they rotated imperceptibly, angles changing ever so slightly, until the reflections contradicted everything we knew of the rooms. Doors appeared where none existed, corners extended impossibly, shadows stretched, curling along surfaces, echoing shapes that belonged nowhere. Outside, the scraping continued, a slow, deliberate rhythm that followed the contours of the cabin. Each sound vibrated through the floorboards, a pulse against our nerves. We could feel the weight of it, though no figure appeared. The cabin itself seemed alive, the mirrors acting as its eyes, tracking us, reshaping the interior to reflect our fear. We moved cautiously, trying not to touch the glass, trying not to provoke whatever intelligence lingered in the reflections. Yet every glance betrayed us. Shapes shifted as if studying us, testing our reactions, learning our habits. A pane that had shown only empty wood a moment ago now revealed a shadow leaning close, just beyond recognition. The air grew cold enough that our breath fogged in the dim light of a single lantern. Every exhalation seemed amplified, swallowed, and mirrored back at us by the glass. Night dragged on, endless, until exhaustion made our minds slip at the edges, tilting perception. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a sentient maze, a watchtower for our terror. And the scraping outside never stopped, always deliberate, always patient, waiting, calculating. We realized, too late, that the mirrors weren't just lying. They were teaching, rehearsing, preparing us for something we could not yet see, something that waited beyond the frames. The first light of dawn seeped reluctantly into the cabin, thin and grey, touching everything with a reluctant coldness. All the mirrors faced us now, perfectly aligned, reflecting empty rooms even as we stood before them. Each pane was still, patient, as if the night had been only a rehearsal. But the silence carried a weight, heavier than any storm or wind. We moved through the rooms, careful, eyes darting to every glass surface. The walls seemed to breathe with an unseen presence, the reflections waiting, watching, measuring our fear. For the first time it became clear. The cabin had never avoided the outside world. It had avoided us. It had shielded itself, not from the forest, but from our intrusion into its domain. A subtle pressure pressed against the backs of our necks, the sensation of being observed not through sight, but through understanding. The mirrors were patient, deliberate, holding themselves in place until the right observer, us, entered their space. The scratches, the shifting angles, the distorted reflections, they were not tricks of light. They were lessons, warnings, tests of perception and restraint. The air hung thick and silent, unbroken, yet alive with anticipation. We felt the house's intention, crystalline and terrifying. It was alive, aware, waiting for its next visitor. Every mirror reflected not just what was present, but what had been, what could be. And now, having seen us, it waited, waiting for the next move, the next gaze, the next soul foolish enough to step inside. We left the cabin with the oppressive feeling that the mirrors followed even beyond the threshold, that the forest outside, still calm, still ordinary in appearance, was only a curtain, and that the house, patient and cunning, would be ready again for anyone who thought it merely hid among the trees. I first came upon it as the sun was dipping behind the ridge, pale light spilling into a clearing that seemed almost untouched. The tree stood there, impossibly smooth, pale-barked, its branches bare, twisting slightly toward the sky. There was a stillness, unnatural, as if the clearing itself held its breath, waiting for me to step inside. Locals had called it the dawning tree, their voices low and tight, warning me about people disappearing near it. I laughed it off at first, curiosity pushing any lingering fear aside. I set up camp at its edge, unpacking my gear with the habitual calm of someone who studies life, not death. As darkness deepened, a faint vibration seemed to hum through the clearing. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't something I could see. It pulsed through the soil, through the very air. I felt it in my chest and my feet, a resonance that made my hair stand on end. I tried to dismiss it, to remind myself I was a scientist and not a child scared of shadows. But the hum didn't stop. It grew more insistent as night swallowed the ridge, a quiet, persistent thrum beneath the stars. By the time I lay down to rest, I could feel it in every breath, in every beat of my heart. The clearing wasn't empty. The tree wasn't just a tree, and in the stillness, I understood that whatever it was waiting, patient, watchful, knowing I had come too close. I woke in the small hours, the night pressing down like a wet cloth. It was just past 3, the kind of hour when the world feels thin and fragile. The tree's branches had begun to move. Slowly, deliberately, they twisted in silence, tracing arcs toward the stars as though aligning themselves with some unseen map. The hum had grown stronger, vibrating through the soil beneath my tent, crawling up through my boots, filling the air with a low, resonant thrum. It wasn't wind. Nothing around me moved, but something in the clearing shifted. Shadows slid between the trunks of other trees, subtle at first, then insistently, almost stalking, as if the darkness itself had learned to step quietly. I strained my eyes, scanning the pale bark, and the air thickened, heavy, almost tactile, pressing against my skin. The branches rotated with purpose, responding to my presence. Every movement felt deliberate, like the tree was aware, tracking, considering. I froze, half expecting the ground beneath me to pulse, or the shadows to detach and reach. Even breathing felt dangerous, as if each exhale announced my location. The branches moved closer, twisting toward me with precision, a silent choreography meant for no human eyes. I realized the clearing was no longer passive, it was awake, watching. I had not entered the forest. The forest, or the tree itself, had entered me. The first light of morning had long since faded, leaving only darkness pressed heavy across the clearing. I leaned closer to the tree, compelled by a mixture of dread and fascination. That's when I saw them, faces pressed into the pale bark, frozen in silent scream or frozen in eternal slumber. Some were human, eyes wide, mouths twisted in disbelief. Others were impossible, warped in ways my mind refused to fully comprehend. They weren't just carved, they shifted, imperceptibly, almost too subtle to notice at first. A blink, a twitch, a fraction of a frown, forming where none had been before. I could feel their awareness, as if they were watching me back, assessing, waiting. A shiver ran through my body. The tree itself seemed to breathe, exhaling a cold draft that slithered down my collar. A branch arched downward, slow and deliberate, forming a canopy that nearly enclosed me. Its movement wasn't chaotic. It was purposeful. The space beneath it narrowed with a sense of intent, creating a trap I couldn't yet name. I stumbled back, the soil soft beneath my boots, but the clearing seemed to push against me, holding me in place just long enough to feel its full attention. I realized then that the tree wasn't just alive, it was conscious, and it had noticed me. Every step backward made the soil beneath my boots feel wrong, soft, almost muscular, as if the ground itself had weight and intention. Each pulse beneath my soles seemed to sync with the faint hum that had begun when night fell, vibrating through the earth, into my legs, climbing my spine. The clearing around the tree was no longer passive. It was aware, shifting imperceptibly, rearranging itself, bending the very space to some pattern I could not comprehend. Branches twisted, aligning in angles too precise to be natural, forming arcs that pressed inward without touch, almost like fingers feeling the edges of my body. Shadows moved between them, fleeting and uncatchable, appearing in the corner of my eye and vanishing when I turned. The air smelled of wet soil and cold resin, pungent, thick, as though exhaling the weight of years the tree had absorbed. Escape seemed impossible. Every route out felt subtly altered, trails lengthening, the forest edge bending back upon itself. The hum rose in pitch and volume, a resonance that pulled at my chest and made my own heartbeat seem too slow, too deliberate. I stumbled, caught between fascination and terror, realizing the clearing had no intention of letting me leave. Not easily, not whole. The tree watched, the ground watched, and I was no longer walking through a forest. I was inside something alive, patient, and very much aware of my presence. I ran before the first light, stumbling through the ridge, branches clawing at my jacket and hair as though trying to slow me down. My lungs burned, my boots sinking into soil that felt alive beneath me, yet every step carried me further from the clearing, or so I thought. Behind me, the hum faded, replaced by a whispering rustle of bark and leaves, as if the forest itself exhaled my name. When I finally reached the safety of the ridge road, chest heaving and fingers numb, I dared a glance at my camera. The images I had taken earlier, the careful study, the notes, the distant shots of the tree, were no longer what I remembered. There, among the pale bark and twisted branches, my face stared back at me, distorted, pressed into the surface, embedded as if the tree had claimed me while I was still alive. A chill rolled across my shoulders, heavier than the night air. The dawning tree had left its mark, permanent and unmistakable. My presence in that clearing was no longer fleeting. Somewhere, unseen, it waited, watching, patient, as though the next observer, the next careless curiosity would meet the same silent, unyielding embrace. I stopped at the overlook, the Blue Ridge fog pooling thick across the asphalt, curling around the guardrail like it had weight. At first, I thought she was just another stranded traveler, standing there pale and still. But then the shadows caught my eye. Two of them stretched behind her, cast long and indistinct in the diffused light. One moved almost normally, tethered to her form. The other shifted subtly, out of sync, like it had its own intentions. The air felt colder than it should, dampness clinging to my jacket. I stepped closer, heart thudding, and the fog seemed to hesitate, almost parting for me, revealing the second shadow again, stretching wider, sliding across the pavement without touching it. My stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. Something about that shadow, it wasn't just cast, it was alive. And I realized, even before I could move, that the fog was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. The shadow moved first. Not her shadow, the second one. It slithered along the pavement like liquid, curling and stretching with a will of its own, independent of her body. The fog thickened around it, swallowing the lines of the overlook, bending like it was alive, and I felt the weight of it pressing at my chest. She didn't move. She stood frozen, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond me, and I realized she wasn't seeing me. The shadow flowed outward, crawling across the asphalt, stretching impossibly long, pausing and then sliding again with careful deliberation. My breath fogged in the cold air, and every instinct screamed at me to step back, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. Something about the way it moved, so patient, so deliberate, made it clear this was no trick of light. It was aware, watching, waiting. And I understood that the fog wasn't just fog anymore. It was a conduit, a path for the shadow, shaping itself around the movement as if it had been training, anticipating, preparing for the moment it could reach me. Her voice was barely audible, a rasp carried on the thick fog, trembling as if each word cost her breath. She said she had been trapped for days, unable to leave, and the pause after each syllable felt like the space between heartbeats. Behind her, the second shadow stretched taller, its form feeding off her fear, elongating in ways the mind refuses to accept, coiling like smoke around the edges of the overlook. I could feel it drawing power from her terror, bending the fog in patterns that shouldn't exist, as though the air itself was alive. Each movement of that shadow was deliberate, fluid, testing the boundaries of the world around it, and every instinct told me it was learning, watching me as much as her. Her body tensed, shoulders rising, spine stiffening. The shadow responded, rising further, unfurling like a living thing that had been dormant for centuries, detached, yet tethered to its host. My chest ached with the urge to run, to break the rhythm of its slow approach, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the way it pulsed, an unnatural heartbeat echoing in the fog. And then it began to detach. One tendril of darkness slipped free, hovering just above the ground, reaching outward with an intent I could feel in my bones. The woman's whispered warnings became cries, swallowed immediately by the fog, leaving only the shadow and me, the air thick with something patient, intelligent, and hungry. The shadow broke free entirely, slithering across the pavement with a will that felt both deliberate and alien. Fog coiled around my ankles like fingers, clinging, trying to slow me as I stumbled backward, every step dragging against the weight of the mist. The woman's scream tore through the quiet, raw and fragmented, echoing off the trees, but it was already too late. Her original shadow had twisted itself loose, writhing in ways that made my stomach churn. I forced myself to run, heart hammering, lungs burning, the cold fog lapping at my legs as though the night itself had turned against me. Behind me, the shadows moved with an intelligence that mocked my panic. The one that had detached led the way, stretching and bending impossibly, while the other mirrored her form, in grotesque, exaggerated imitation. Each step I took seemed to lengthen the space, but the fog never thinned. It only grew heavier, pressing into my skin, my ears filled with the whispers of something patient and unyielding. I reached the edge of the overlook, the car gleaming faintly through the mist. Every instinct screamed to run faster, but the shadows kept pace, silent, fluid, inevitable. I threw open the door, fumbling with keys, and felt the cold tendrils brush against my back, brushing my clothes like they were already inside me. When I slammed the door and started the engine, the fog seemed to recoil slightly, but I knew it wasn't retreating. It was waiting, watching, learning. The road stretched before me, longer than memory should allow, each turn dragging out into unnatural distance. Fog pressed against the windshield, curling at the edges like smoke from some unseen fire, seeping into the car's corners as though it wanted inside. My hands shook on the wheel, knuckles white, and I kept glancing in the rearview, half expecting the shadows to have already climbed into the back seat. Every mile felt wrong. The asphalt curved in ways it never had, dips and rises that made the headlights stretch pale fingers into the darkness. Shapes moved in the periphery, a shadow flicking against the trees, the ghost of a form gliding across the fog. Each time I blinked, the shapes seemed closer, and a low, wet hiss threaded the night air, just beyond hearing, just beyond comprehension. The car's engine roared beneath me, but it was powerless against the weight pressing in. The shadows clung to every reflection, haunting every mirror and pane of glass. They didn't just follow, they studied, adapted, learning how I moved, how I feared. My heart beat a frantic rhythm as if signaling them, and I realized in cold clarity, that some things don't simply trail behind. They ride the edges of your panic, feeding on every glance, every shallow breath. I risked a glance behind, and my stomach dropped. Two dark shapes clung to the edges of the glass where nothing should have been. One mirrored the woman's posture perfectly, silent and patient, as though it had stepped into her skin. The other, twisted impossibly, limbs and angles that shouldn't exist, coiling and stretching like liquid shadow alive in its own will. The fog pressed closer, crawling through the cracks of the car, swirling around the seats and dashboard, thick and almost tangible. Every instinct screamed to stop, to throw open the doors and run, but my legs were frozen, my body locked to the wheel. The air smelled of wet earth and something acrid, metallic, like iron on stone, and I realized my own breath was visible, clouding before me, trembling with fear. I tried to drive faster, but the road twisted unnaturally beneath the tires, stretching and bending as though the night itself were reshaping around the pursuit. The shadows stayed, watching from the rearview mirror, waiting patient, learning the edges of my panic. One blink, and the impossible shape was closer, almost touching my shoulder. I understood then that some things feed on fear, and once they find it, they never let go. Even as the headlights cut through the fog, the shapes remained, clinging silently, following every movement, and I knew the night had become theirs. I came upon the grove late in the afternoon, drawn by the unnatural stillness of the Georgia woods. The trees there were thin, their trunks pale as bone, leaves absent, branches twisting toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Locals called it the Dawning Grove, muttering stories about people who wandered too close and never returned. I laughed it off at first, setting up my small camp to study the soil and flora, convinced the tales were superstition. As darkness fell, the air thickened, almost pulsing around me, carrying a faint hum I couldn't place. It was subtle at first, a vibration through the ground beneath my boots, through the roots and moss, as if the earth itself were alive and breathing. I told myself it was wind, insects, my imagination, but the feeling persisted, settling like a weight on my chest. Each shadow seemed to linger longer than it should, stretching toward me without reason, waiting. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the hum had grown louder, resonating through every surface, echoing in a way that felt deliberate. Somewhere deep in the grove, a branch scraped the forest floor slowly, methodically, and I froze. My journal trembled in my hands. The grove was watching, and I realized with a sinking certainty that I was no longer observing, it was observing me.